guys, today's project is we're going to make some flange binding for a quilt. We're going to start off by cutting the outer piece that we want to show all the way around the quilt, and it's going to be cut at 1.5 inches wide. You need to figure out how much binding you need for your quilt. I know that I have 60 inches on each side, so I need at least 240 inches. So I'm going to cut several pieces of this 1.5 inch for the outer binding, and I'll bring you back whenever I'm ready to cut the inner flange. I feel like singing my boyfriend's back because this is working so well. Okay, so for the flange part of your binding, you want to cut at 1 3/4 inches. So I'm going to cut all these pieces out, and I'm cutting 2 at a time. And let's see, come over here. So there is 4. Slide it down here. 1 3/4. Isn't it nice when it cuts that so easily? So that gives me 8 pieces for my flange binding. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to join this together. I'll show you in just a second. Okay, I like to lay my fabric out so that it's end to end. Go ahead and stitch this up. We all know how to put binding together. You take and you make an L. Since I haven't trimmed my selvages off, I'm going to meet them up behind the selvages. Okay, and we all know how to put binding together. I'm going to take and I'm going to sew right across this end. And I'm going to put my binding together, both pieces, and I'll meet you back here as soon as I have that done. Okay, and this is how you put binding together. What you do is you take the 2 pieces and you cross them to make an L. Because I haven't cut my selvages off, I'm crossing mine so that the selvages won't end up in my seam. And then I start at the corner up here, and I sew straight across to the other corner. You may notice that I have seam tape down on my table. Helps me get that straight stitch. And I also, like I said, haven't cut my selvages off. So we're just going to sew these all together. We're going to do the same thing for the green. And I'll bring you back once we have all of these sewn together and we're ready to trim the ends. Okay, now that everything is sewn together, I'm going to go through and I'm going to cut where I seamed them off. And so what I'm going to do, you'll notice again that I have selvages in here. I'm going to take the selvage part out, and when I unfold them, they should lay flat like that. So that's 1. I already snipped my little threads apart as I went.
I would like to go up along that edge just a hair. Make sure that none of that selvage does actually end up in my binding, because it will create lumps, and we don't want lumps. I'm going to do the same with the pink. Like it there. Don't want to miss any. Okay, so there's the green done. I've got all these little pieces pulled over out of the way. Here's my pink. And I'm going to start at the first place where I joined it. The same thing. Come up a little bit, go over, and she's got all that selvage off. Again, and you can do this from either side, it doesn't matter. If you're ambitious or a perfectionist, you can lay this down on your cutting table and do it with your rotary cutter. I have done that before when I was really hurting. But I'm just trying to get this all done so I can show you guys the next step. It may seem like an odd combination of colors, but that green is going to pop against the quilt that I'm putting this on, and it's going to look really fantastic.
You don't want to cut super close to your seams, but you do want to, leave yourself about 1/4 of an inch. But you do want to get all that selvage out of there because it will create problems later. And we have one last one to do. Okay, so now that all that's done, let's get lined up so we can sew. And I'm going to do this really, really easy. All I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that the right sides of each fabric face one another. A little harder to tell on this green. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the green and I'm going to lay one side down flat. And I'm going to make sure that my seam is down on this side or up, depending on which one I need. Then I'm going to match the right side of the pink to the right side of the green. And I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam right down through here to put these two together. And after you've sewn your strips together and ironed so the seam allowance goes toward the flange, then you're going to bring the edges over and iron them together. That's going to leave the flange showing on the other side. So when you attach this to your quilt, you have a flange showing all the way around the edge. I'll show that in just a minute. Once I have my binding ironed, I like to wind it up on one of my pull noodles so that it stays ironed, and it makes it easier for me when I get ready to sew it onto my quilt. So we're going to wind this all up. It keeps it all together. And I make sure to wrap that edge so that the edges stay together on the binding as I go. And this binding is just as easy as applying any other binding. You're going to put it so the binding that you want on the outside is down towards the quilt, and then you're going to do your corners just like you would do a corner on any other binding. Once you have your binding made, you just sew it on. And there's my pretty little quilt with its flange binding applied along the side. So I have a 2-color binding on this baby. It's green and a pretty pink. And it wasn't any more effort or work than putting in a regular binding on the quilt.